This section we're going to be looking at intergroup contact theory. It's one of the most widely used social psychology interventions. Basically, it argues that if we want to produce social change, we need to bring segregated groups together. For example, if you want to improve people's attitudes towards outgroups or reduce prejudice, and we do this via promoting intergroup contact. The origins of the problem of segregation are deep and widespread. They go right back through slavery, colonialism, apartheid. W.E. Du Bois, 1903, The Souls of Black Folks, another fantastic book worth reading, said that the problem of the 20th century is going to be the problem of the colour line. Certainly it's prophetic. I mean, the colour line we see from the Black Lives Matter movement, Fees Must Fall movement in South Africa, the history and consequences of racial segregation have shaped our social psychology and the worlds that we live in. If you take a look at apartheid, we think about apartheid as a grand scheme, but each little town and little city and school and neighborhood felt the effects and continues to feel the effects of apartheid. Take Pietermaritzburg, for example. This is the apartheid map of Pietermaritzburg. You can see already the inequality and injustice of segregation and apartheid. Look at the mass of all the prime land. The city center was designated a white area. This was an Indian area, Northdale, Allendale, etc. There we have historically a colored area, Eastwood and Woodlands, and there towards Edendale, along the Edendale Road, a black designated area. So all cities were cut up and partitioned in this way that privileged white people. The interesting thing in Pietermaritzburg analysis indicates that the main burden of relocation, because of course there was forced removals, fell on Indians, and the Indian community suffered great losses. So they had to move out of their homes, and you can imagine all of a sudden everyone has to sell their home and move. The property prices plummeted. There were all these homes on the market where the Indian people used to live, and now they all had to go and buy homes in designated areas. So there's this high demand over there. The property prices went up. So essentially the Indian community was impoverished through this policy. It was deeply impacted. And as a very prominent spokesperson for the Indian community in Pietermaritzburg said, the price we paid socially, financially and psychologically cannot be calculated in rands and cents. The cost of being forcibly removed from your home, shoved into another area, is enormous. So how do we start undoing these effects? Now that's really the question that we confronted in the post-apartheid situation. And we can see how entrenched segregation is. It's a global phenomenon. It's not only in South Africa. This over here is a picture of Detroit in the United States. Reynolds Farley's work, famously, his paper was called Chocolate City, Vanilla Suburbs. You can see this in the city center. It was predominantly black, and the suburbs in American cities are predominantly white. So there we had black people forced into city centers, old decaying city centers of these cities like Detroit, which really did suffer from massive urban decay, and the white people spread out to new places of luxury in the suburbs. We can see a very similar pattern emerged in post-apartheid South Africa. But it's not only racial segregation. Northern Ireland, take a look at this map of Catholic versus Protestant areas in Northern Ireland. There's a picture from Belfast, what they call peace walls, like walls that just ran through, dividing the Catholic from the Protestant part of the city. And it doesn't only happen in cities and in large areas. This is a photograph of undergraduate students at UKZN, and you can even see there that sort of black students sit in certain areas. There's a row with white students, Indian students sit over there. There's informal kinds of segregation that emerge within our society. So what are the effects of segregation? Is segregation a problem? Well, segregation produces prejudice, suspicion and anxiety. If each group lives in their own segregated, they wonder, what's going on over there? Prejudice, anxiety, suspicion. It produces conflict, it's associated with conflict. Thomas Pettigrew argued once it's a linchpin of inequality. And you think segregation in schooling, segregation in employment, and segregation in housing, these three levels of segregation lock poor people into poor areas, poor schools. Their children go to those schools. And these cycles of inequality are produced through segregation. Segregation also, point number 4, limit development, social development. The famous anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, he argued that all the great innovations come from exchange across cultures, and segregation keeps people separated. And you can see that today in the role of the internet in bridging these boundaries has really allowed lots of progress in science and other innovation. And of course, segregation limits human individual potential. We looked at the consequence in the previous lecture about the effect of segregated schooling for African American children. And as soon as that desegregation happened, how all of a sudden human potential becomes possible. And there's lots of evidence, the Shook and Clay paper over there, there's evidence that living in desegregated dorms, for example, at university, improves the academic performance of both black and white students. So intergroup contact has many positive consequences. But of course, segregation can also enable radical forms of political action. You think of Black Lives Matter movement, etc., that racially identified protest movements, segregated protest movements can be effective. So we need to balance this view. So a big effort in social psychology has been to promote intergroup contact. Excuse me. One of psychology's most effective strategies for improving intergroup relations is contact. How do we reduce prejudice? Well, the most effective way is by promoting intergroup contact. And we can do this at schools, at universities. If you create mixed dorms, mixed work teams of students of different races, it produces positive consequences in prejudice reduction, in academic performance, etc. And it's something that's so easy and practical to implement. So we introduced this in the previous lecture around social change interventions, the contact hypothesis. So the origin of this idea that we need to promote intergroup contact comes from the Brown versus Board of Education, that 1954 Supreme Court case in the United States, where the educational system was segregated. Kenneth Clark and others like Gordon Allport were involved as psychologists in informing the courts about the effects of segregation. And one of the arguments that Clark made was segregation we can desegregate. Everyone was worried if you desegregate all these like racist people, they're going to get violent, we have to be scared of them. But Clark argued no, that desegregation itself would be the cure to prejudice and racism. So all we do is we desegregate, we put people together, and the prejudices themselves will disappear. And in fact, there's much evidence that did happen over the course of the 20th century. This was formulated, the contact hypothesis, by Gordon Allport. He states that prejudice reduction occurs when members of different groups meet. See, they interact with each other, but under certain conditions. It needs to be equal status. They need to be working for common goals. They need to cooperative. So it needs to be a cooperative form of interaction. It's no use they meet and start fighting. They need to develop intimacy, close relationships, and there needs to be institutional support the schools need to welcome this transformation. So we can see even in our schools in South Africa, post-apartheid, many of them have accepted that they're racially integrated, but the culture of the school has remained the same. There hasn't been this kind of institutional support and welcoming to embrace a new form of identity. So you have the optimal contact conditions: equal status, common goals, there needs to be cooperation, there needs to be institutional support, and if we can develop intimacy, close friendships. A meta-analysis is an analysis of a whole lot of studies. So 515 different empirical studies on the effects of contact on prejudice reduction was meta-analyzed in a famous paper by Pettigrew and Trop. And lots and lots of evidence for the power of intergroup contact to reduce prejudice. The more contact, the less prejudice. The more rigorous the studies, the stronger the effect. The better research, the stronger the effect. When the optimal conditions are met, the stronger the effect. And they find that even though you have contact with a few people at school, that the prejudice reduction actually applies generally to others of that group. It even applies to reducing prejudice against other groups. So there's a lot of evidence from the social psychology literature that contact is an effective form of social intervention, prejudice reduction. Why? Why does it work? Well, what are the processes of change? Well, one thing that contact does, it changes your behavior. Before you didn't speak to black people or white people or Indian people, and now all of a sudden you have an opportunity to talk. And you realize, hey, I'm talking to, we've got good, some of my friends, and it changes the prejudice. We also learn about the outgroup. When people are segregated, they develop suspicions and hostilities. They don't know what those people are really like. What are those people really like? But as soon as people come together in intergroup contact, you realize, people just like me. So we learn that a lot of these stereotypes that we have are not true. The third way is that you develop affective ties, especially the reduction of anxiety. When there's segregation, there's lots of anxiety associated with contact, and empathy, the production of empathy. You feel if other people are suffering from another group, you feel, wow, imagine if that applied to me. But under segregated conditions and prejudice, you think, it's them over there. But as soon as we have friends and we have intergroup contact, we realize that, we're all human beings. We can empathize with the situation of the other. And then, of course, there's in-group reappraisal. Often people think their groups are the best. And Thomas Pettigrew called it deprovincialization. That we actually realize that there's a whole world of different groups. These different groups have got different values, different norms. They're all human. They all got value. They're all good. And ours is just one group amongst many. You think, for example, about the diversity of people on the planet. There's a tendency for people to think they're great, but if you have contact, if you travel and you go and spend time with other nations, you realize, hey, we're just one nation amongst many different nations. And so deprovincializing these kinds of ethnocentric views that people have. Don't worry about the complexity of the study, but it just shows these are 3 different time periods. It's done in South Africa, that's why I got this line. So cross-group friendships at time 1 reduces anxiety and increases empathy at time 2. It also changes our perception of the outgroup, that they're not all the same, that there's differences, individual differences in that group. And then at time 3 over here, it produces positive outgroup attitudes and reduces negative action tendencies. So there's a lot of evidence in studies like this, kind of longitudinal studies that show that promoting contact at one stage has a whole lot of effects down the line to produce these optimal outcomes. We've focused a lot on social identity theory in this course, and social identity theory is also important to the process of change, because when we have contact, when we create friends in other groups, we start decategorizing. We start realizing, look here, we're all human beings. We're all the same. We all have our fears, our hopes, anxieties, etc. So one effect of contact is decategorization, getting rid of the perception of these categories. Another effect is that we create, rather than just decategorizing and saying, we're all humans, we can create a common identity. We might be from different groups, but we're psychology students, or we're working on this project together, or we're in the same sports team. So a common identity can be a mechanism for social change as well. And then the third way, and this is an important issue, the dual identity theory. For these changing attitudes to be long-standing, and for the changing attitudes to generalize, not just that we now like our friends of this group, but actually still prejudiced against others, the argument is that we still need our racial identities or whatever needs to be salient. So Brown and Houston argue contact between in-group and out-group members who can be regarded as sufficiently typical or representative of their groups. We're still interacting and we recognize that this is still a person of this other group. And I'm becoming friends and I'm liking this person. So you've got this dual identity. We've got the shared identity in the same sports team, but we also recognize that we're from these groups. This is the form of identification that produces the most, the long-lasting effects. So it doesn't only have to be direct contact. We don't actually have to have friends of the other group. Indirect contact, if our friends have friends of that other group, and that often happens on social media. We might not have many friends of different race groups, but we've got friends who've got many friends of other race groups, and that has also been shown to reduce prejudice. And there's quite substantial evidence now that even imagined contact, you can imagine having a friend of another group, and that can reduce prejudice. It shows how powerful intergroup contact and friendship formation is in challenging prejudices. But there are also problems with contact theory, and the two of them here is the first is that, yes, contact's all in well, nice to have contact, but in most societies, very often in societies, there is no contact, or there's very little contact, or the contact that we have is negative contact or hierarchical contact. So the focus on contact theory is on contact. It's on the optimal conditions of making friends, but actually, in fact, in many societies, you can take, for example, South African society. It's been desegregated, but we find new forms of resegregation, and often the contact that we have isn't optimal. Are there instances of negativity? Some of these negative contacts, for example, at schools between learners of different groups can be painful and can have a long-lasting negative effects. And so, yes, it's nice to focus on contact, but actually very often our societies become resegregated. Informal patterns of segregation emerge, and there's often negative contact, experiences of racism in those situations. So there's one of the problems. Another problem is that in contact theory, often it imagines that you've got these two equal status groups coming together, but as we've learned in this course, society is hierarchical. And status hierarchy can affect contact and the effects of contact. And most contact researchers focus on reducing the prejudices of majority groups. In other words, white people are racist. How can we reduce their racism? Desegregate, and we'll find prejudice reduction. But the asymmetries have other kinds of effects. Contact has other types of effects across these asymmetries. And I'll unpack some of these here. Here's just for an example, a quick little study we did in Scotland Beach 1999. And you can see the reality of non-contact over here. The different color dots are different color people. So here's all the white people sitting over there, the blue dots. Here's Indian people over there. And here are colored people. And the red dots are African beachgoers, and then this is on the 26th of December at 8:30 in the morning, and then by 2:30 many African people have come to the beach, and there's a few white people still over here, but the white people disappear, and there's an idea of like, don't go to the beach in the white community on certain days because there are going to be too many African people there. And that's just a little cameo of the kinds of segregation that have re-emerged in post-apartheid South Africa. We don't often find people sharing institutions in such an equal way. And this over here is a second point here about about asymmetries of contact. That contact for historically minority groups have different effects from historically majority groups. And it's especially associated with social change. So contact can promote social change amongst white people. Yes, they have more favorable attitudes towards Africans. White students that have contact with African friends, they promote social change. They think that we need to get rid of apartheid, we need to move on, affirmative action, we need those policies. But what effect does contact have for black students? Well, this is a study we did in a nationally representative study, and this over here is for African respondents. So the more contact that they had with whites, yes, it did reduce their prejudice, negative attitudes towards whites, but it also reduced the sense by which they felt discriminated. It also reduced the sense by which they thought their groups were discriminated against. So this has come to be called the sedative effect of contact. Sedative because sedative puts you to sleep. Sort of politically, for social change, it puts you to sleep. Contact helps you to accept the status quo as absolutely fine. So what does effects do contact have on minority groups? This is evidence over here, not only for black South Africans, but there's been many studies now across the world for minority groups. It does reduce prejudice, but it also reduces perceptions of discrimination. It reduces feelings of injustice. Actually, the system is fine as it is. It reduces support for redress, for collective action. So the sedative effect of prejudice reduction, it decreases the political awareness and resistance of historically disadvantaged groups. And you can remember from our study, our lecture on social identity theory, it's the sense of illegitimacy that can promote social change and social competition in our society, create more just worlds. So in conclusion, yes, there's lots of evidence that contact reduces prejudice. Contact and segregation, new patterns of segregation and negative contact that limit this effects of contact, and then finally contact can produce sedative political effects. But it does emphasize for us the importance of desegregation and social change. So you remember in a previous lecture we spoke about radical forms of transformation. We need not just to sort of bring individuals in contact interpersonal, we need systemic changes in our schools, in our institutions to produce optimal forms of social